The gate was locked, but the lights inside were on. Not a single car in the driveway. No voices, no movement. Just a mansion glowing in the dark, fully powered, fully alive, and completely abandoned. By morning, the lights were off. By the end of the week, copper wiring was missing. By the end of the month, someone had been inside rooms no one was supposed to enter anymore. Whatever had gone wrong here wasn't recent. It had been waiting. This wasn't an isolated lapse. Windows started appearing open that no one admitted opening. Security logs showed doors unlocking themselves at hours when the system insisted no access had occurred. Contractors refused to return after finding furniture rearranged overnight. One of them quit on the spot, leaving tools behind, saying only that the house didn't stay finished. The cost wasn't just repairs. Every attempt to secure the estate created new vulnerabilities. Cameras failed in rotation, never all at once. Locks jammed selectively. Each fix exposed another weakness, as if the house responded to intervention by shifting the problem elsewhere. Ownership changed hands on paper, but control never fully transferred. And that raised the question no one wanted to answer out loud. How does a mansion this valuable become this untouchable? Not through decay alone, not through age. Something about this place resisted closure. Not abandonment, but suspension. The kind of error that doesn't collapse. It lingered. The estate had been designed to impress without explanation. Long sight lines that made rooms feel supervised even when empty. Corridors that curved just enough to hide their ends. Public spaces built too large for private use. Private rooms built too exposed for comfort. Nothing illegal. Nothing obviously wrong. Just a sequence of decisions that only worked as long as everything else went perfectly. That perfection didn't last. The first truly strange detail was the wing that never appeared on official floor plans. It existed physically. Staff had cleaned it, electricians had wired it, but it wasn't listed on any final drawing. When auditors noticed the discrepancy decades later, they assumed clerical error. But the original blueprints showed the same omission. The space had been built, paid for, and forgotten simultaneously. From there, the pattern widened. Rooms designed for events that stopped happening. Technology installed for guests who never arrived. Maintenance schedules based on occupancy levels the house never again reached. The estate functioned like a system calibrated for a future that failed to occur. What nobody noticed at the time was that the problem didn't start when the house was abandoned. It started when it was completed. The mansion wasn't too large. It was too early. It had been built for a version of permanence that no longer existed, owned by a family whose name carried weight, but not continuity. Every addition assumed expansion. Every upgrade assumed relevance. There was no plan for contraction, no graceful way to scale down, only forward momentum. When the momentum stopped, the structure didn't adapt, it froze. That freeze is what made the abandonment so expensive. Empty buildings usually deteriorate predictably. This one didn't. Certain areas aged rapidly, while others remained pristine, as if preserved. Mold bloomed in sealed rooms while exposed halls stayed untouched. Climate systems failed selectively, protecting some wings while destroying others. Restoration estimates swung wildly because no two inspections matched. Investors walked away not because the numbers were bad, but because they wouldn't stabilize. And beneath all of this sat a quieter, older decision. The land itself had been chosen for symbolism, not practicality. It was meant to feel removed without being remote, private without isolation, exclusive but visible. That balance worked until it didn't. Development crept closer. Roads changed. Sightlines closed. The estate lost the context it depended on, becoming too prominent to ignore and too inconvenient to integrate. That's when the name started to become a liability. It drew curiosity instead of respect, trespass instead of invitation. Preservationists argued it was untouchable. Developers argued it was unusable. Both were right. The mansion existed in a narrow category, too valuable to destroy, too compromised to restore cleanly. What sealed its fate was not scandal, or bankruptcy, or crime. It was hesitation. Every owner believed someone else would solve the underlying problem. Every caretaker treated the symptom instead of the structure, and every delay made the next intervention more expensive, more invasive, more likely to fail. By the time the estate was officially classified as inactive, it had already developed a reputation for resisting decision. Projects stalled, permits expired, partnerships collapsed quietly. No single disaster, just accumulated friction, the kind that doesn't make headlines, the kind that leaves a house lit up at night with no one inside. Because the mistake wasn't that the mansion was abandoned. The mistake was that it was never allowed to end. And whatever had been built into its design, financially, architecturally, psychologically, was still operating long after the people it was meant to serve had disappeared. That error didn't belong to a person anymore. It belonged to the house. The first real cost appeared when nothing was happening. No renovations, no events, no residents, just standing expenses that refused to flatten out. Insurance premiums climbed instead of shrinking. Security contracts multiplied after each breach. Landscaping bills persisted even after large sections were deliberately allowed to overgrow, because unmanaged growth caused structural damage faster than neglect ever did. The estate consumed money simply by existing. What made this dangerous wasn't extravagant. It was unpredictability. Traditional abandoned properties degrade in known ways. This one behaved like a living system that rejected equilibrium. Shutting down one wing caused humidity spikes in another. Powering down climate control led to failures in parts of the house not connected to the same circuit. Engineers stopped giving guarantees. Every solution came with disclaimers. And yet, walking through the mansion, the illusion of readiness remained intact. Furniture stayed positioned as if expecting return. Curtains were never removed, only tied back. Table settings were packed away instead of discarded. The house didn't look finished. It looked paused, as if the occupants had stepped out mid-decision and never came back. This mattered because pausing is more expensive than stopping. A closed system can be simplified. A paused one must be preserved, just in case. That just in case became the most expensive line item on every spreadsheet. The mistake that allowed this was subtle and early. The estate had been designed around presence rather than use. Spaces existed to be witnessed, not occupied. Large rooms had no secondary function. Smaller rooms depended on staff circulation patterns that no longer existed. Without people moving through it as intended, the mansion lost efficiency instantly. Every square foot required justification. None provided it. Attempts to repurpose the estate revealed another problem. The house resisted reinterpretation. Offices felt theatrical. Residences felt exposed. Event spaces felt oversized. Even storage felt inappropriate, as if the building rejected being treated as infrastructure. It had been optimized for a single identity, and once that identity expired, flexibility collapsed. This is where the family name stopped helping. What once opened doors now raised questions. Investors assumed complications. Partners expected public scrutiny. Municipal agencies hesitated, worried about optics. No one wanted to be responsible for changing something that still felt symbolically active. Even in ruin, the mansion became an artifact without permission to evolve. At this stage, caretakers started noticing a behavioral pattern that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with incentive. Each short-term solution increased long-term dependence. Temporary security systems damaged original structure. Emergency fixes voided future restoration grants. Preventative measures disqualified tax exemptions. Every action narrowed the available options. The house was no longer expensive because it was large. It was expensive because it was stuck between states. Not heritage, not utility, not decay. A limbo that charged rent. This would have been survivable if the surrounding environment had remained static. It didn't. Development pressures shifted traffic patterns. New construction disrupted drainage. Changes in zoning altered noise and light exposure. The estate's original isolation strategy backfired. It became visible without being accessible. Seen, but unreachable. That visibility attracted attention of the wrong kind. Explorers, photographers, bloggers, people who documented rather than preserved. Each intrusion forced responses that further altered the property. Boarding up entries changed airflow. Removing signage invited trespass. Increasing patrols increased liability. Doing nothing increased risk. The house began generating costs without any internal failure. The failures were external reactions to its presence. That's when delays became strategic mistakes. Every postponed decision was justified as caution, but caution accumulates interest. By the time serious redevelopment proposals surfaced, the baseline condition of the estate had degraded unevenly. Some sections required museum-level conservation. Others required demolition-level intervention. Integrating the two drove estimates into ranges no one could commit to publicly. Negotiations collapsed quietly. What made the situation irreversible was not money leaving, but confidence. Once professionals stopped agreeing on what the mansion was, asset, burden, relic, planning fractured. Without consensus, no plan could survive long enough to be implemented. And all of this traced back to a single assumption embedded in the original design, that relevance would persist. The house assumed permanence in a world that shifted faster than permanence allowed. It assumed continuity of influence, attention, and purpose. It assumed the future would resemble the moment of its completion closely enough to justify its scale. That assumption expired, but the structure built around it didn't. By the time the estate entered its longest inactive phase, the problem was no longer whether it could be saved. It was whether saving it would repeat the same mistake, preserving a form that demanded a context that no longer existed. The mansion didn't collapse under neglect. It hardened under indecision, and that made the next error unavoidable. The next mistake wasn't architectural, it was administrative. Someone decided the estate could be held until the right moment arrived. Not sold, not transformed, not closed, held. The word sounded neutral. It wasn't. Holding required constant intervention, without decisive direction. It meant preserving options while silently eliminating them. Committees formed, subcommittees followed. Reports contradicted earlier reports without resolving them. Each review cycle assumed the house would remain unchanged long enough for consensus to emerge. That assumption quietly failed every year. During this period, the mansion became over-documented and under-understood. Surveys mapped every crack but couldn't agree on causes. Historical assessments cataloged finishes but ignored system. Financial projections assumed best-case stabilization scenarios that never repeated twice. No one owned the whole problem. Each group owned a slice, and the slices didn't align. The estate began to suffer from something more dangerous than decay: misaligned preservation. Certain elements were protected too aggressively. Others were left exposed because they weren't considered character-defining. That distinction shifted depending on who was writing. Floors were saved while ceilings failed. Facades were reinforced while interiors rotted. The house stopped aging evenly. This unevenness made future work exponentially harder. Restoration thrives on consistency. This property lost. Matching materials became impossible because sections had been treated at different times, under different philosophy. Reversibility vanished. Repairs could no longer be undone cleanly. Each intervention locked the next one into a narrower path. The estate's reputation shifted again, not haunted, not cursed, but difficult. That word circulated quietly in professional circles. Difficult sites get fewer bids. Fewer bids mean less competition. Less competition means higher costs. Higher costs reinforce hesitation. The loop closed. Meanwhile, the surroundings kept changing. What had once been peripheral land became desirable. Infrastructure improved nearby, but not directly serving the estate. Traffic increased. Noise patterns shifted. Light pollution altered the experience of the property at night. The mansion's original design relied on darkness and distance to feel grand. Without them, scale turned awkward. This is when the house began to feel watched rather than admired. Visibility changed behavior. Security responses grew reactive. Temporary fencing appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Each version communicated uncertainty. The estate no longer projected authority. It projected vulnerability, and vulnerability invites testing. Unauthorized access increased, not dramatically, but persistently. Small breaches, short stays, no vandalism at first, just presence, people documenting rather than destroying. Each incident forced reports, which forced meetings, which delayed decisions further. The cost curve bent upward again. Insurance carriers reassessed risk. Coverage tightened. Premiums rose. Conditions multiplied. Each condition demanded compliance actions that altered the structure further. The mansion was being modified to satisfy paperwork, not purpose. That's when the idea of partial activation surfaced. Use part of the estate. Leave the rest dormant. A compromise designed to reduce carrying costs without full commitment. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it introduced a new imbalance. Active zones required modern code compliance. Dormant zones remained frozen. The interface between them became fragile. Systems didn't respect boundaries. Air moved, moisture migrated, vibrations traveled. The house punished segmentation. Partial activation failed quietly. What followed was the longest stretch of inaction, justified as strategic patience. But patience without direction degrades into avoidance. The estate lingered in that state long enough for institutional memory to thin. People involved early left. New stakeholders inherited incomplete understanding. Decisions were revisited without awareness of why they'd been deferred before. The house outlasted strategy. By now, the original intent behind the mansion had faded from relevance. It no longer mattered who built it or why. What mattered was what it demanded now. And what it demanded was clarity, something no one was willing to provide. Because clarity would require admitting that preservation, as previously defined, was no longer possible without reinvention, and reinvention risked backlash. So the estate remained intact but unsupported, protected but unmanaged, celebrated but unused. A structure optimized for an identity it could no longer perform. The deeper issue was becoming visible. The mansion wasn't failing because of neglect. It was failing because every solution treated it as a static object rather than a dynamic liability. And as long as it was seen as something to be saved later rather than addressed now, it would continue to erode the very value everyone hoped to preserve. The error wasn't delaying action. It was believing delay was neutral. The turning point came disguised as an opportunity. A proposal arrived that promised relief without confrontation, not restoration, not redevelopment, a partnership, shared responsibility, a framework that would unlock potential while respecting legacy. The language was careful. It avoided finality. That alone made it attractive. The estate wouldn't change ownership. It would change function, partially, just enough to justify investment, not enough to provoke resistance. This is where the cost became irreversible. The proposal required selective upgrades, life safety systems, accessibility paths, limited public access zones. None of these were inherently destructive, but each one demanded compromises that the original structure could not absorb gracefully. Compliance required intrusion. Intrusion required justification. Justification fractured consensus. Work began anyway. Temporary solutions were installed with permanent consequences. Conduits routed through ornamental spaces. Fire suppression threaded around features never designed to be interrupted. Doors widened where proportions mattered. Each change passed review individually. Collectively, they altered the building's internal logic. What no one accounted for was how fragile the remaining unaltered sections had become. Once the house lost uniformity, it lost predictability. Load paths shifted subtly. Environmental controls became uneven. Stress redistributed. Minor issues began appearing in areas untouched by construction. The mansion responded to change by revealing new weaknesses elsewhere. The partnership stalled before completion. Funding paused. Leadership changed. Legal reviews reopened questions. Thought settled. What remained was a partially modified estate, no longer eligible for certain protection, not yet compliant enough for use. The worst possible state. This wasn't abandonment. It was interruption. And interruption is corrosive. Materials exposed during construction remained exposed. Systems installed but not activated aged faster than those never installed at all. Documentation became fragmented. Future teams struggled to distinguish original conditions from temporary ones. Accountability blurred. The house entered a phase where every problem could be traced to a previous fix. At this point, Narratives began to diverge. Some described the estate as a victim of neglect. Others called it overprotected. Both were inaccurate. The real issue was incoherence. Too many intentions layered without hierarchy. The mansion wasn't decaying randomly. It was expressing conflict. Internally, the estate became a map of unresolved decisions. One wing prepared for public use, another sealed for preservation, a third left untouched due to uncertainty. Movement between them felt wrong. Transitions were abrupt. The house no longer flowed. Visitors sensed this immediately. So did workers. Projects slowed. Estimates padded themselves defensively. Contractors requested exemption or walked away. Each refusal reinforced the site's reputation. Difficult became impossible. The surrounding narrative shifted again. The mansion was no longer framed as something to save, but something to manage risk around. Liability eclipsed legacy. Meetings focused on containment rather than vision. The estate's value was now measured by how little trouble it caused. That metric punished initiative. Every proposal carried downside without guaranteed upside. Doing something risked exposure. Doing nothing preserved stasis. Stasis became policy. And yet, the costs continued. Deferred maintenance isn't neutral. It compounds invisibly. Water intrusion followed paths created by earlier modification. Pest activity increased where new voids existed. Microclimates formed. The house developed internal weather. This is when the estate began consuming attention disproportionate to its footprint. Emails multiplied. Site visits increased. Consultants overlapped. The mansion became a recurring agenda item without resolution. It absorbed institutional energy without yielding progress. The irony was unavoidable. The effort to preserve the estate's importance made it unimportant operationally. No one could justify prioritizing it over active need, but no one could release it either. The original error, the assumption of continuity, had now replicated itself at an organizational level. Everyone assumed someone else would eventually solve it. By the time this became obvious, the structure had crossed a threshold. Not structural failure, strategic failure. The mansion could no longer be addressed as a single project. It had fragmented into problems with incompatible timelines. Preservation demanded patience. Compliance demanded speed. Finance demanded certainty. None could coexist. This fragmentation was the real abandonment. Not empty rooms, but disconnected intention. The estate stood intact, but no longer whole. And the longer it remained that way, the more it began to define itself, not by what it was, but by what it prevented. Progress, closure, resolution. The house wasn't waiting anymore. It was resisting. The pressure finally shifted from preservation to containment, not public. Official language still spoke of stewardship and long-term vision, but internally, the goal changed. The mansion was no longer something to be solved. It was something to be prevented from getting worse in ways that could not be explained. That distinction mattered. Budgets were reclassified. The estate stopped competing with development projects and started competing with risk mitigation. Line items moved from capital improvement to exposure management. The house was no longer an opportunity. It was a variable. This reframing altered behavior immediately. Access tightened. Documentation narrowed. Fewer people were allowed inside, not because of danger, but because every additional witness complicated the narrative. The less seen, the easier it was to justify inaction. But reduced visibility created a new problem. Without regular presence, minor failures escalated unnoticed. Small leaks became structural concerns. Pest activity crossed thresholds. Systems that required periodic operation ceased from disuse. The house didn't just sit idle. It stiffened. This is the paradox of large estates. They require activity to remain stable. Stillness accelerates failure. Attempts to introduce controlled activity, tours, inspections, limited use, ran into the same contradiction as before. Any use required compliance. Any compliance required alteration. Alteration triggered opposition. So activity was minimized again. The estate entered a defensive loop. Externally, interest increased. Not investment interest, but attention. Articles, people asking why something so prominent remained unresolved. Each inquiry demanded an answer that could not be given honestly without acknowledging institutional paralysis. So answers became vague. Plans were under review. Timelines were being assessed. The future was open. None of this was false. None of it was useful. Internally, turnover accelerated. People who inherited responsibility for the mansion quickly learned that progress was unlikely and risk was guaranteed. Careers moved forward elsewhere. Knowledge left with them. What remained were files, not understanding. The estate became a legacy problem without living memory. This is when the most damaging assumption took hold, that time favored preservation. It didn't. Materials aged out of availability. Craft knowledge disappeared. Regulatory frameworks shifted. What was permissible under one code became forbidden under another. The longer decisions were deferred, the fewer options remained that wouldn't require drastic compromise. The mansion was aging faster politically than physically. Meanwhile, the surrounding area completed its transformation. Density increased. Expectations changed. What had once been tolerated as eccentric became framed as obstruction. The estate wasn't neutral land. It was a barrier to coherent planning. Pressure mounted quietly, not to demolish, but to justify. Every year, the question grew sharper. Why does this still exist in this state? And every year, the answer became harder to articulate without admitting failure. That admission never came. Instead, the narrative shifted toward inevitability. The idea that some properties simply exist beyond resolution, that the mansion's condition was unfortunate but natural. That complexity excused inertia. Complexity became camouflage, but complexity didn't stop deterioration. It only delayed accountability. Stage, the estate had lost something intangible but critical: momentum. Even failed projects create movement. This one created suspension. Nothing advanced, nothing concluded. The house existed in an extended present with no path forward. This had a psychological effect on anyone involved. People stopped imagining outcomes. Meetings focused on avoiding mistakes rather than achieving results. The safest decision became postponement. Postponement became default, and defaults hardened. The house absorbed this mindset. It became defined by what couldn't be done. Each failed attempt added to a growing archive of cautionary examples. Future proposals referenced past collapses. History was used not to guide action, but to discourage it. The mansion turned into precedent, not for ambition, but for restraint. By the time serious reevaluation was suggested, the estate had already crossed another invisible threshold. Restoring it would now require explaining why previous protections had failed, why funds had been spent without outcome, why so much attention had produced so little change. That explanation threatened reputations, so reevaluation stalled. The cost of honesty exceeded the cost of decay, and decay, unlike transparency, could be managed quietly. This is how the estate survived without improving, how it remained intact without being alive, how it became a standing example of what happens when no one is willing to make the final call. The mansion wasn't preserved, it was deferred indefinitely, and indefinite deferral is not neutral. It is a decision that compounds silently, converting value into obligation, potential into burden. By now, the question was no longer what the estate could become. It was whether anyone would accept responsibility for what it already was. Because the longer no one did, the more the house itself dictated the terms. And those terms were becoming unforgiving. The final phase didn't begin with collapse. It began with normalization. The estate stopped being discussed as a crisis. It became background, a known issue folded into routine planning, referenced but rarely examined. When something becomes familiar, it stops demanding resolution. Familiarity dulls urgency. This was the most dangerous moment. Maintenance shifted from preventative to reactive. Instead of asking what the house would need in 5 years, caretakers asked what would fail next month. Short horizons replaced long vision. The mansion was no longer treated as a system, but as a sequence of isolated problems. That fragmentation accelerated internal drift. One section was stabilized just enough to pass inspection. Another was sealed to reduce liability. A third was left untouched because touching it would trigger requirements no one wanted to meet. The house stopped being a single object. It became a patchwork of tolerances. And patchworks don't age gracefully. This is where the estate crossed into a condition that professionals rarely admit: Managed decline, not neglect, not abandonment, but acceptance that improvement was unlikely. The goal became to slow loss rather than reverse it. Once that mindset took hold, decisions changed tone. Repairs were chosen for invisibility rather than durability. Materials were selected for compliance, not compatibility. Documentation focused on defensibility, not clarity. Everything was done with an eye toward justification later, not success now. The House responded accordingly. Systems installed to meet minimum standards clashed with older infrastructure. Temporary fixes became permanent by default. Deferred issues migrated. Problems didn't disappear. They relocated. Moisture moved. Stress redistributed. The building learned how to fail quietly. This quiet failure was harder to argue against. There was no singular event to point to, no headline-worthy damage, just steady erosion. Each year, the cost of reversing course increased, while the visible urgency decreased. The worst combination. At this stage, external pressure resurfaced, not from developers or preservationists, but from auditors. Questions became procedural. Why was this still on the books? Why were funds allocated without outcome? Why did projections keep shifting? These weren't philosophical questions. They were operational. And operational questions demand answers. The estate's defenders framed it as exceptional, unique, too complex for standard timelines. That argument worked until it didn't, because exceptions must eventually justify themselves, and justification requires results. Results never came. Instead, the mansion accumulated explanations. Each explanation referenced a previous constraint. Each constraint referenced a previous decision. The chain extended backward indefinitely, but never forward. There was no next step, only context. Context became the shield. But context doesn't stop deterioration. It only explains it. By now, the house had outlived most of the people who remembered its intended role. It existed as a problem inherited by those with no emotional attachment, only institutional responsibility. That shift mattered. Emotion tolerates ambiguity. Institutions don't. Pressure built for closure, not demolition, not restoration, but resolution. A decision that would remove the estate from indefinite consideration. Something final enough to stop the drain on attention and resources. This is where the mansion's original error returned in full. It had been built to project permanence without planning for irrelevance. Now it faced irrelevance without permission to end. The structure had no exit strategy, and neither did the people managing it. Every proposed conclusion carried unacceptable consequences. Demolition risked backlash. Full restoration risked failure. Sale risked loss of control. Conversion risked identity erosion, so nothing advanced. The estate reached a state where all options were worse than delay. Delay once again became policy, but delay was no longer passive. It required active defense, legal positioning, narrative management, strategic silence. The House demanded effort just to remain unresolved. This is when the cost stopped being financial. It became reputational. The longer the mansion remained frozen, the more it symbolized indecision. Not just about architecture, but about governance. It became an example others cited quietly when arguing against bold commitments. Remember what happened there. The House's influence inverted. Instead of inspiring ambition, it discouraged it. That was the final transformation. The estate no longer failed because of its size, its age, or its design. It failed because it became a warning, a reminder of what happens when decisions are postponed long enough to lose legitimacy. And warnings are rarely preserved. They are tolerated until they're no longer useful. By the end of this phase, the mansion still stood, walls intact, roof holding, systems limping. On paper, it survived. But survival wasn't success. The house had become something that consumed energy without producing meaning. A structure maintained not for what it offered, but for what it prevented: controversy, accountability, closure. The original intention, to create something enduring, had succeeded in the most hollow way possible. It endured, but it no longer mattered why. And that meant the final chapter wouldn't be written by vision or ambition or even failure. It would be written by exhaustion, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the the kind that waits until everyone involved is too tired to argue anymore. The end didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived with fatigue. No final meeting, no decisive vote, just a gradual thinning of attention until the estate stopped appearing on agendas altogether. The mansion wasn't resolved. It was outlasted. People moved on. Priorities shifted. New problems demanded urgency. This one remained, unchanged, waiting for a moment that never returned. What survived was the structure itself, still standing, still consuming just enough to avoid collapse. That persistence created the illusion of stability. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. No fire, no implosion, no scandal. The house remained quietly intact. Inside, the costs continued to accumulate. Deferred systems reached the edge of functionality. Components designed to last decades expired simultaneously. Repairs that had once been optional became unavoidable, but unavoidable didn't mean actionable. It meant documented, logged, deferred again. At this point, the mansion had become something no one planned for, an operational ghost. It existed materially, but not strategically. It required resources, but didn't justify them. It demanded oversight, but resisted purpose. This is where the original error finally echoed back. The estate had been conceived as a symbol meant to project continuity beyond individuals, a place designed to outlast its moment. That worked. What failed was the assumption that continuity alone creates meaning. Without renewal, endurance becomes inertia. The house endured so thoroughly that it prevented resolution. Every year it stood made it harder to explain why it shouldn't. Every year it aged made intervention more complex. Time, which had been treated as an ally, became the constraint that closed every exit. Eventually, the conversation narrowed to one quiet truth. No one wanted to be the last person responsible. Responsibility implies authorship. Authorship implies ownership of consequences. The estate had accumulated too many consequences for any single actor to claim, so it remained. The lights stayed off. The gates stayed closed. The systems idled. The mansion entered a state that looked like preservation from a distance and like surrender up close. And that's when the irony became complete. The house achieved the permanence it was built for, but without relevance, without function, without voice. It became background architecture, a constant presence that shaped decisions simply by being there, even as it contributed nothing forward. Its legacy wasn't cultural or architectural, it was procedural. The estate taught institutions how to avoid finality, how to delay without admitting delay, how to protect something into irrelevance, how to mistake endurance for success. Nothing dramatic marked this realization. No report summarized it. No document closed the file. The understanding settled slowly, unevenly, the way exhaustion does. The mansion had won, not by thriving, but by refusing to conclude. In the end, the most expensive thing about the estate wasn't maintenance or compliance or missed opportunity. It was the energy spent keeping it unresolved, the constant low-level effort to explain why it was still there, why nothing had changed, why something would happen eventually never arrived. And so the house remains what it became long ago, a decision frozen mid-motion, a structure designed for permanence that never planned for irrelevance, a symbol that outlived its meaning and then refused to disappear. The mistake wasn't building it. The mistake was believing that once something endures, it will always justify itself. That belief shaped every choice that followed. It delayed ending. It resisted transformation. It replaced action with preservation and preservation with paralysis. The mansion stands because no one finished the story, and that is its final condition. Not abandoned, not restored, not destroyed, just left, perfectly intact, indefinitely unresolved, quietly proving that endurance without direction doesn't preserve value. It only preserves the error.